It has been 28 years since the streets of Los Angeles echoed with the shocking news of Christopher Wallace's death, the man the world knew as Biggie Smalls, or the Notorious B.I.G. That morning of March 9, 1997, changed the trajectory of hip-hop history forever. Yet, even as decades have passed, questions surrounding his murder continue to haunt fans, music historians, and his own family. Biggie wasn't just a rapper, he was a poet of the streets, a lyrical genius who painted vivid pictures of struggle, ambition, and survival in an unforgiving world. Rising from the crack-infested corners of Brooklyn, he became the voice of a generation. His words were raw and real, capturing the pain and complexity of life in urban America. But behind the fame was a young man who knew his time might be short. Friends say he often spoke about dying young, a premonition that sadly came true. When he was gunned down at just 24 years old, the world lost a legend, and his family, especially his mother, Wallace Wallace, and his two children CJ and Tiana, lost the man behind the myth. Over the years, theories surrounding Biggie's murder have spun in all directions: gang retaliation, music industry rivalries, police corruption, and even coordinated cover-ups. While many speculated, only a few truly knew what Biggie had feared, what he had shared behind closed doors, and what signs he may have left behind. For more than 2 decades, his children remained largely silent about the details, until now. CJ Wallace and Tiana Wallace, the children who grew up without their father, have finally begun to share their side of the story. With emotional clarity and years of reflection, they are confirming what many long suspected, that Biggie Smalls was not only targeted but knew he was a marked man. They speak not just to honor their father's legacy but to shine a light on truths that were buried beneath fame, money, and silence. This video explores Christopher Wallace's life from humble beginnings to his tragic end. It unpacks the chaotic web of power, betrayal, and systemic failures that contributed to his death and the decades-long mystery that followed. More importantly, it brings forward the voices of those left behind, especially his children, who now seek justice and truth in a world still captivated by Biggie's legend. Brooklyn, New York in the 1970s was a place of conflict and survival. For many black families in the borough's impoverished neighborhoods, life was defined by tenacity. It was in this environment that Christopher George Latour Wallace was born on May 21, 1972. Raised by his Jamaican immigrant mother, Wallace Wallace, young Christopher grew up in the neighborhood of Clinton Hill, bordering Bedford-Stuyvesant, an area riddled with drugs, violence, and economic hardship. Despite these harsh surroundings, Wallace worked tirelessly as a preschool teacher to give her son a better life. She raised him as a single mother after separating from his father, Selwyn George Latour, a small-time Jamaican politician who abandoned the family when Christopher was just 2 years old. In interviews, Wallace often recalled her son as a bright and imaginative child, quiet, observant, and deeply intelligent. From an early age, Christopher was drawn to language and storytelling. He excelled at school, especially in English, and his creative flair was evident. But outside the classroom, the streets had their own influence. By his early teens, he began selling drugs, partly out of economic necessity and partly as a result of the environment surrounding him. The lure of fast money was strong, and in a world where opportunities were scarce, dealing was a ticket to power. Still, even amid this dangerous lifestyle, Biggie's love for music never faded. He began rapping as a teenager, influenced by artists like Big Daddy Kane, Slick Rick, and Rakim. He would perform for local crowds on the corners, gaining a reputation for his deep voice, sharp wit, and incredible storytelling abilities. He adopted the name Biggie Smalls, a nod to a character in the 1975 film Let's Do It Again, and his reputation spread across boroughs. His big break came when a demo tape he recorded reached the ears of Sean Puffy Combs, then an A&R executive at Uptown Records. Impressed by Biggie's raw talent, Combs signed him to his new label, Bad Boy Records. Thus began a meteoric rise that would soon shake the music industry. By 1994, Biggie released Ready to Die, an album that was both a personal journal and a cultural earthquake. Tracks like Juicy, Big Papa, and Gimme the Loot portrayed the duality of his life: the dreamer and the dealer, the poet and the criminal. The album was lauded by critics and fans alike, signaling that a new king had arrived on the East Coast. His fame grew rapidly, and with it came wealth, women, and more scrutiny. In the midst of this whirlwind, Biggie married fellow singer Faith Evans and became a father to CJ Wallace. Despite his tough exterior, those closest to him described Biggie as loving and gentle with his children. A man torn between his past and the future he was building. But the higher he climbed, the more dangerous things became. The mid-1990s were the golden era of hip-hop, and Biggie Smalls stood tall as its reigning East Coast monarch. His lyrics were sharp, cinematic, and deeply rooted in authenticity. Each rhyme reflected not only his experiences but those of an entire generation of black youth growing up amid systemic oppression, broken homes, and violence. Ready to Die wasn't just a commercial success, it was a cultural statement. Biggie's voice was magnetic, and his presence commanded attention. Overnight, he went from Brooklyn street hustler to national icon. He toured extensively, made television appearances, and his singles climbed the charts. He brought a swagger to the East Coast that redefined the image of New York hip-hop. But fame came with a price. As Biggie rose, so did Death Row Records on the West Coast, led by Suge Knight and fronted by Tupac Shakur. While the two rappers initially shared mutual respect, and even friendship, things quickly soured. Miscommunication, media spin, and deeper industry manipulation began to drive a wedge between them. Tupac's 1994 shooting at Quad Recording Studios in Manhattan became the turning point. Though Biggie and his team denied involvement, Tupac believed otherwise. He felt betrayed. Songs turned into diss tracks. The media picked up the feud and amplified it into a war between coasts. Biggie responded to Tupac's provocations subtly at first, but later more directly. The growing animosity drew battle lines not just in music but in the streets. Fans, gang affiliates, and industry insiders took sides. It was no longer just about art, it was about loyalty, territory, and survival. By 1996, the situation had escalated beyond control. Tupac was shot and killed in Las Vegas on September 13th, and speculation swirled about who was responsible. Many pointed fingers at Biggie and Bad Boy Records. While he publicly mourned Tupac's death, behind closed doors, Biggie grew paranoid. He felt eyes on him wherever he went. Friends recall him becoming more withdrawn, more cautious. He started traveling with heavier security and avoided certain cities altogether. The release of his second album, Life After Death, was approaching. Biggie believed it would cement his place as a legend, but some around him felt that he feared he wouldn't live to see it succeed. And they were right. March 9, 1997. It was supposed to be a celebration. Biggie was in Los Angeles to promote Life After Death and to attend the Soul Train Awards. Diddy had organized an after-party at the Peterson Automotive Museum in the Mid-Wilshire neighborhood. Celebrities, artists, and industry insiders packed the venue. Security was tight, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Around 12:30 a.m., Biggie and his entourage left the party in a green Chevy Suburban. As they waited at a red light on the corner of Wilshire Boulevard and South Fairfax Avenue, a dark Chevrolet Impala SS pulled up beside them. Without warning, the driver rolled down his window and opened fire. 4 bullets struck Biggie. One of them fatally pierced his chest. Panic erupted. He was rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, but it was too late. At 1:15 a.m., Christopher Wallace was pronounced dead. News of his murder spread like wildfire. Shock and grief engulfed the music world. Candlelight vigils, street memorials, and media coverage poured in. Brooklyn mourned its son, and hip-hop lost one of its greatest voices. But almost immediately, the questions began. Why was Biggie in Los Angeles so soon after Tupac's death? Was his murder random, or was it a planned hit? Where was the killer now? The LAPD launched an investigation, but early missteps and inconsistencies plagued the case from day one. No arrests were made. Witnesses were hesitant, security footage went missing, and speculation ran rampant. The questions only deepened as weeks turned into months, and months into years. The investigation into Biggie's murder was marred by chaos from the very beginning. Despite the high-profile nature of the case, the Los Angeles Police Department appeared disorganized and ill-prepared to handle the gravity of the situation. Detectives arrived late to the scene, and crucial witness statements were either never collected or later misplaced. Surveillance footage from the Peterson Automotive Museum, where the after-party had taken place, was allegedly missing or not operational. Basic procedures, such as canvassing nearby businesses and obtaining security recordings, were ignored or delayed. Public outcry grew louder as it became clear that justice would not come quickly, if at all. Many fans, journalists, and hip-hop figures expressed their frustration, comparing the lack of urgency in Biggie's case to similar patterns of inaction when black men, particularly those from marginalized communities, were murdered. Biggie's family, particularly his mother Voletta Wallace, demanded answers. She had never supported her son's career in rap music, fearing it would bring violence into his life. Her worst fears had come true. Now, she watched as investigators fumbled and as her son's killer remained free. The LAPD initially described the shooting as a drive-by, gang-related incident, likely part of a larger East Coast, West Coast conflict. But even this narrative lacked substance. There were no confirmed ties to any gang, and the shooter had never been identified. Rumors of corruption within the LAPD began to gain traction. Conspiracy theories sprouted across media platforms, fanned by anonymous tips, shadowy informants, and even former law enforcement officers. Despite hundreds of leads, the official investigation stalled. No suspect was named publicly. No one was charged. The case would ultimately go cold. And yet, whispers of the truth remained. Former detectives, journalists, and industry insiders hinted that the truth about Biggie's murder was far more complex and sinister than the public had been led to believe. Behind closed doors, Biggie's family knew that something had always felt off. And over the years, his children began to quietly piece together the truth that they, too, would one day bring to light. Within days of Biggie's death, rumors began to swirl, not just among fans, but within the hip-hop industry itself. The timing of the murder, just 6 months after Tupac Shakur's own death in a similar drive-by shooting, was too coincidental for many to believe it wasn't connected. Initial reports speculated that Biggie's death was an act of revenge for Tupac's murder. After all, Tupac had been killed in Las Vegas on September 13, 1996, after leaving a Mike Tyson fight. He was also the subject of diss tracks and rumors linking him to East Coast rappers, particularly Biggie. Despite both families denying any true animosity, the narrative had already been set in motion by the media and record labels that had exploited the feud for publicity. As Suge Knight, CEO of Death Row Records and Tupac's former mentor, publicly accused Bad Boy Records and Biggie of being involved in Tupac's death, a retaliatory act seemed plausible in the eyes of the public. Even more chilling were reports that Biggie himself had received death threats in the weeks leading up to his murder, specifically warning him not to come to Los Angeles. But the rumors didn't stop there. In the years that followed, journalists like Randall Sullivan and former LAPD detective Russell Poole raised disturbing allegations of a deeper plot. According to their investigations, certain officers within the LAPD may have moonlighted for Suge Knight and Death Row Records, raising the possibility that Biggie's murder was orchestrated by people within law enforcement itself. These explosive claims were never officially acknowledged by the LAPD, but internal scandals began to emerge. In the wake of Biggie's death, his family began to suspect that the police not only failed to prevent the murder but might have played a role in ensuring it happened. Still, without concrete evidence, the rumors remained just that, rumors. For years, Biggie's children said nothing publicly, but behind the scenes, they were listening, watching, and remembering everything. Wallace Wallace was never the type to stay silent when justice was denied. From the very beginning, she suspected that her son's murder was more than just a gang-related incident. In her eyes, Christopher was not just a rapper or a public figure. He was her son, a father, a human being whose life had value. In 2002, Wallace Wallace took the bold step of filing a wrongful death lawsuit against the city of Los Angeles. The lawsuit alleged that corrupt LAPD officers were involved in Biggie's murder and that the department had actively covered it up. The case was groundbreaking. It pointed fingers not at faceless gang members or record executives, but at sworn law enforcement officers tasked with serving the public. At the heart of the lawsuit was former Officer David Mack, who had been convicted in an unrelated bank robbery case. Allegations emerged that Mack had connections to Death Row Records and was closely tied to other officers with questionable conduct. Russell Poole, the lead LAPD detective initially assigned to Biggie's case, became a key whistleblower. He later resigned from the force after being silenced for pursuing leads that implicated fellow officers. Poole's claims were staggering. He believed that LAPD officers were directly involved in Biggie's murder and that their connections to Suge Knight ran deep. When Poole's findings were ignored, he went public, and eventually, his work inspired the book Labyrinth and the film City of Lies, starring Johnny Depp as Poole. Despite the weight of evidence, Valletta's lawsuit faced repeated delays, legal hurdles, and missing documentation. Key files went missing from LAPD archives. Witnesses refused to testify or mysteriously recanted their stories. The case dragged on for years without resolution, eventually being dismissed in 2010 after procedural complications. Even as her case collapsed, Valletta never stopped speaking out. In interviews, she often said, "I will never stop fighting for my son." Her courage became a guiding light for CJ and Tiana Wallace. As they grew older, they saw the emotional toll the case had taken on their grandmother and began to feel the same fire that had driven her crusade for justice. It would take years, but eventually, her grandchildren would carry the torch themselves. CJ Wallace was just 5 months old when his father was murdered. He never got to hear Biggie read him a bedtime story or walk him to school. But even in his absence, Christopher Wallace's spirit loomed large in CJ's life. Raised largely by his mother, Faith Evans, CJ grew up surrounded by music and fame. He bore a striking resemblance to his father and was often told he had Biggie's eyes, Biggie's voice, and even his sense of humor. As a teenager, he pursued acting and played his father in the 2009 biopic Notorious. The performance was praised, not only for its accuracy but for the emotional authenticity CJ brought to the role. But despite the public's embrace, CJ kept much of his personal journey private. For years, he refused to speak at length about his father's murder. It was not until recently, on the 25th and now the 28th anniversary of Biggie's death, that CJ began to open up in interviews and documentaries. In a 2025 interview with The Source, CJ made headlines when he said, "My father knew something was coming. He told people. He told family. It wasn't paranoia, it was real." He went on to confirm that Biggie had received multiple death threats before traveling to Los Angeles and that he had been warned not to go. CJ also spoke candidly about what he believes, that there was a network of people, possibly even law enforcement, who had an interest in silencing his father. He was getting too big, too powerful. They didn't want him to survive past that second album, he said. These statements sent shockwaves through the music community. Fans who had long believed there was more to the story now felt validated. And perhaps most importantly, CJ's courage opened the door for his sister to finally speak her truth as well. Tiana Wallace was just 3 years old when her father died, but her connection to him never faded. Unlike CJ, who had been in the public eye through acting, Tiana had largely stayed out of the spotlight. She chose a quieter life, pursuing education and business, eventually launching a clothing line inspired by her father's legacy. In interviews, Tiana often said she didn't want to profit from tragedy. She loved her father as a man, not just as an icon, and her grief was deeply personal. For years, she refused interview requests and stayed away from hip-hop media. But as she grew older, especially in her late 20s, she began to see the importance of truth, not just for her family, but for history. In 2025, following CJ's public statements, Tiana agreed to appear in a new documentary series produced by Netflix. In the emotional third episode, she tearfully revealed that Biggie had called her mother days before his death, expressing fear. He said he wasn't sure he'd make it back from LA, she said. He told her he felt something was going to happen. That he had a bad feeling. Tiana also confirmed that after her father's murder, unidentified individuals approached her family with offers of money in exchange for silence. There were people who didn't want this investigated, she said. People in positions of power. Her statements aligned with what Wallace had said for years, but now, the words carried new weight. Tiana was a new generation. A voice not shaped by the trauma of the 90s but by the resolve to see things made right. In the years since, both CJ and Tiana have launched non-profit initiatives to honor their father's memory, provide opportunities for Black youth in underserved communities, and advocate for criminal justice reform. They have also vowed to reopen the case independently, using private investigators and new legal strategies. They are no longer children grieving in silence. They are warriors in search of truth. CJ Wallace's public statements in 2025 were more than cathartic, they were seismic. The son of Biggie Smalls, long known for his composure and quiet strength, had finally chosen to tell the world what his family had always suspected. His interviews ignited a wave of renewed media coverage and public interest in the unsolved murder of one of hip-hop's most iconic figures. CJ's tone was calm but firm. He didn't seek vengeance. What he wanted was clarity. There's a difference between revenge and justice, he told Rolling Stone. I don't want anyone else to die. I want the truth to come out, no matter who it hurts. He recalled moments from his teenage years, when his grandmother Valletta would sit him down and walk him through news clippings, court transcripts, and police reports. She saved everything, CJ said. She used to say, if we don't speak up, they'll bury him twice. That stuck with me. CJ's investigation into his father's murder began as a personal journey but quickly evolved into something greater. Working with a team of legal experts and independent investigators, CJ began to comb through the evidence that had been ignored, altered, or dismissed. They reached out to former officers, gang affiliates, and journalists who had reported on the case decades earlier. One of the most disturbing revelations CJ discussed publicly was the existence of phone records and testimony suggesting that Biggie had been under surveillance in Los Angeles, possibly by both federal agencies and corrupt LAPD officers. He wasn't just a rapper. He was a voice, CJ said. They were watching him. He was becoming too influential. CJ also confirmed that his father had written several letters and made private recordings expressing fear for his safety in the weeks leading up to his death. It's all there, he said. He saw it coming. He warned people. His statements were a powerful validation for those who had long believed that Biggie's murder was more than a random act of violence. And as the son of the victim, CJ's voice carried the kind of moral authority that couldn't be denied. If CJ Wallace represented calm reflection, then Tiana Wallace embodied fierce clarity. After years of quiet mourning and silent observation, she had reached her limit. Her decision to speak out in 2025 was not simply about adding her voice to the conversation, it was about confronting a legacy of denial. In her sit-down with Essence, Tiana appeared composed but unflinching. "People forget I lost my father too," she said. "I may not be famous. I may not be in movies. But I've carried this pain my whole life." She discussed her father not as a global icon, but as a man, gentle, thoughtful, and protective. "He used to call me his little boss," she smiled. Even in his letters and voicemails he'd say, "Daddy loves you, little boss." That's who he was. Tiana revealed that her father's final conversations with her mother and grandmother were filled with dread. He told them he had a bad feeling. That someone was going to make sure he didn't come back from LA. He wasn't scared, he was resigned. He knew. She also recounted strange visits and phone calls in the days after his death. "There were people warning us not to go public. Not to question the police. They'd say things like, 'Don't dig too deep.'" At the time, Tiana was too young to understand. But as she grew older, those cryptic warnings became more sinister. Tiana decided to launch a campaign titled #JusticeForBIG, using her platform in the fashion world to push for transparency and accountability. She partnered with advocacy groups, civil rights attorneys, and independent media outlets to spread awareness. "I'm not doing this for clicks," she said. "I'm doing this because my father was murdered in cold blood, and 28 years later, not a single person has been held accountable. That's not justice. That's erasure." Her emotional honesty and fiery determination breathed new life into the case. For the first time in decades, the world began to believe that real answers might finally be within reach. The FBI's involvement in Biggie's murder investigation was long cloaked in secrecy. For years, Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) requests were denied or heavily redacted. But in 2011, portions of the FBI's files were finally released, and they painted a damning picture. Among the documents were memos detailing the use of informants, communication with LAPD officers under suspicion, and the alleged suppression of evidence that implicated law enforcement. One file even noted that an unnamed LAPD officer had refused to testify, fearing retaliation from fellow cops. Even more disturbing were reports that Biggie's movements in Los Angeles had been tracked by more than one government agency. Some files suggested that federal agents had advanced knowledge of threats against Biggie but failed to act. Whether this was negligence or something more sinister remains unknown. CJ Wallace commented on these files publicly, saying, "There's too much smoke for there not to be fire." They knew. They knew he was in danger, and they didn't protect him. Journalists and independent investigators began publishing deep dives into the FBI's files, connecting dots that had long been scattered. Some theorized that Biggie was being watched not just because of the East Coast-West Coast feud, but because of his growing influence among young black audiences. His messages about poverty, crime, and systemic oppression struck chords that extended beyond music. The most haunting theory of all? That Christopher Wallace wasn't just a victim of music industry beef, but a political target, silenced before he could grow into a voice for change. With nearly 3 decades of rumors, theories, and conflicting stories, it became harder to separate myth from reality. Some said Biggie knew he was going to die and embraced it. Others claimed he faked his death and escaped to Cuba, a theory also applied to Tupac. The Biggie Lives conspiracies were fueled by tabloid photos, anonymous tips, and supposed sightings around the world. While these theories were mostly dismissed, they revealed a deeper truth: people weren't ready to let go. Biggie's absence left a hole in music, in culture, and in the hearts of those who knew his work. For some fans, believing he was alive was easier than accepting the injustice of his unsolved murder. Experts in criminal justice and hip-hop history offered more grounded perspectives. Most agreed that a combination of greed, police corruption, and industry politics created the perfect storm. Biggie's death wasn't random, it was calculated, and the system allowed his killer to walk free. What's most troubling is that even after documentaries, books, lawsuits, and FOIA releases, Biggie's murder remains officially unsolved. There is no closure, no named suspect, and no peace for those who loved him. And perhaps that's why the quest for answers remains so urgent. In the aftermath of their revelations, CJ and Tiana Wallace chose not to retreat into silence. Instead, they began a new chapter, one focused on justice, advocacy, and positive change. For them, honoring their father meant more than wearing his face on merchandise or quoting his lyrics. It meant standing for the values he lived and died with: truth, loyalty, and perseverance. In 2025, the siblings formally launched the Christopher Wallace Memorial Foundation, a nonprofit aimed at 3 key goals: promoting criminal justice reform, supporting youth arts and education programs, and advocating for unsolved homicide victims and their families. The foundation's motto, "It was all a dream, until we made it real," echoed Biggie's most famous lyric and signaled a shift from mourning to action. CJ focused much of his energy on social equity and cannabis reform, building on his prior work in the legal cannabis industry with Think Big and Frank White. He partnered with community organizers to support formerly incarcerated individuals and helped draft legislation to push for transparency in cold cases, especially those involving police misconduct. Tiana, meanwhile, used her growing influence in fashion to educate younger generations about Biggie's life beyond the stage. Her clothing line, Notorious, evolved from a boutique tribute to a full-fledged activism brand. She began incorporating educational pieces into her campaigns. QR codes on shirts that linked to documentaries, interviews, and advocacy toolkits. Biggie Smalls died 28 years ago, but his story has never rested. Beneath the headlines and theories was a truth waiting to be told. A truth that his children CJ and Tiana Wallace are now boldly sharing with the world. They have confirmed what many suspected, that Biggie feared his murder, that signs were ignored, and that the system failed him at every turn. If you appreciated the truth being told and want more video like this, hit that like button. Every like helps spread Biggie's legacy and the voices of his children. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update.